Governing the work environment. So this is another one that you're likely to get a number of questions on. You're not going to get a huge number of questions, I don't think, but it is a sort of an important kind of concept here, in that they have this whole thing called now practice management, and so they want to ask questions about how you manage a practice. It used to be in the other systems that these questions kind of got buried into others, and so they didn't have to have a whole lot of specific, like, all right, how do you actually run the firm itself? And now they need to fill that exam, and for good reason. It's an important thing. So this has now become an important idea on this particular exam. But like I say, it won't be loaded with questions on this, but will definitely be some. And the first thing I want to just mention is that there's going to be sort of two different ways of thinking about it. One is the fact that the work environment you're talking about is architects. So there's going to be a whole bunch of architecture related issues about things that govern the work environment for architects. But then there's also going to be a whole series, and I'm just going to write it as business. Any business doing anything out in the world has a series of issues that govern it. And you need to be aware of those issues in order to be able to run a practice, to be able to start and run a practice. And so nothing on this exam is going to get particularly deep into any of these things. But, for example, when architects think of OSHA, they almost always, the occupational, whatever OSHA stands for, safety hazard something, I don't know, they almost always immediately assume that we're talking about what the GC has to be thinking about, because the OSHA stuff is all the GC's world, about when they're on a job site and what they're building and all of that. But in fact, an office is also a job site, and people, like, as an architecture firm, in the same way that if you were a lawyer's firm, you'd have to make sure that it was a safe environment for those lawyers, for those architects, for anybody visiting, those kinds of things. So there's a whole series of different places where these different branches of government, or local government, federal government, places that reach into these firms, and you have to be sort of respecting those, not just making a nice, interesting place to work, but also respecting the governance of that as a process. Heather, do you want to add something?
Well, I think right now we're only kind of touching upon, well, with OSHA anyway, the physical safeness of things, right?
Right, and there's many more, right?
There's many more, such as discrimination.
Right. I'm not going to write all these things out. There we go. All right. I just made it sound like I'm asking people to discriminate, which I didn't mean. I should have said discrimination, but you get the idea. And that comes from making sure that there is sort of equity in hiring, making sure that there is equal pay for folks, that sometimes is a law, sometimes is more a code of ethics issue, sometimes is just sort of kind of the marketplace. But the idea of sort of how you govern that workspace, making sure that things are not discriminatory, making sure that things are equitable kind of across the board. Another example, kind of, I think, ripped from the headlines, if you will, would be the Me Too stuff that's going on. And far be it from me, the old white man, to tell everybody about Me Too, but the idea that, architecture has been a pretty male-dominated enterprise for, many decades, and it does not have a particularly stellar history from sexual harassment and pay equity and issues along those lines. And so I can completely imagine that they will, on the exam, want to be current and relevant and have questions along these lines that you should be sort of thinking about and ready for. There's also a whole bunch of other sets of issues, right? I mean, it's not just discrimination and safety. It's also, there's a process to how you pay people. You're paying taxes. You're getting health benefits or whatever it happens to be. Another interesting example of sort of a hot topic recently has been whether whatever we're calling interns these days if they're being paid hourly, can they be paid time and a half for overtime? In the old days, nobody ever did that, but it's actually now considered the assumed way that you're supposed to operate through the AIA kind of thinking about these things these days. So there's a whole series of these different issues, but I think you'll find that most of them will sort of fall into a couple of different categories. Like I said, some will be specific to an architecture firm, which have to do with keeping your CE credits up and having the correct number of licensed people on board, and that there's always somebody on board who can stamp a drawing, is working on a set, all of those kinds of things. There's specific issues that are just any business related. So that's making sure you have insurance, making sure so you have an example that goes into both of those categories would be in the architecture side, you have professional errors and omissions insurance. On the business side, you have general liability insurance, which just means the next time that Mark comes over to my office when he trips on the rug and falls and tries to sue me, that I have some insurance to cover that, right? That doesn't fall into my professional liability, it falls into my general liability. So these are all like a couple different ways of thinking about these things. And when you're looking at an exam question, you're sort of parsing it down to figure out what's the question really about.
And that's one thing, if I can interject for just a moment. I've heard a lot of test takers, and I myself was very guilty of this. NCARB is not out there to trick you. And I think that's something that a lot of us are guilty of inferring into some of these questions. Their questions are very literal, and they're testing your knowledge on very specific points, and their questions are, I don't want to say black and white because they can feel kind of fuzzy, but they're not expecting you to go, well, if we're asking X, we're implying Y and Z as well. I'm not sure if I'm kind of getting off the point here,
they'll tell you if Y and Z are a part of the question. Yeah, that they're not trying to trip you up. They're just trying to see if you know about a certain topic. So I think what you're getting at is don't overthink it.
Yeah, that was much better stated.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. That's a really important thing to say, because nobody is going to expect that because you've studied for the practice management segment of the ARE that you are suddenly an expert on the close reading of the clauses on the general liability insurance waivers. It's not meant to be that level of detail. It's really just kind of big picture. How does the whole thing work? You create teams, you figure out who needs to be a part of something, you figure out what it means to have a firm in a governing locale. You're licensed by the state. You understand that once you say you're a firm, that you have certain rules and regulations you need to follow, some of which are sort of about safety and things like that. Other ones are about paying people equally and being a sort of reasonable boss, right? So that all of these things just kind of fall into place and you have a sort of an idea of that overarching idea.